The US Space Agency, NASA, has unveiled the 4 astronauts who will fly on what would be the first crewed mission around the moon in more than 50 years. Among them, the engineer Christina Koch, the first woman ever to be assigned to a lunar mission, the US Navy aviator, a pilot, Victor Glover, the first African-American ever assigned as an astronaut to fly around the moon, the Artemis II lunar flyby, expected as early as next year. The astronauts won't land on the moon, but their 10-day mission will pave the way for a touchdown by another crew. Professor Lerothodi Leeuw is an astrophysicist at the University of the Western Cape. He joins us with more on this. Professor Leeuw, good afternoon to you. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. How significant is this mission? It's been a long time since humans have been around the moon.
Yes, more than 50 years now. And the significance is that the mission is for humans to return to the moon for a long-term stay, and then to plan for further exploration going to Mars. So those are the big significant points on that.
If I remember correctly, in the 1960s and the 1970s, the Americans only sent white men to the moon.
Yes.
We now have a crew with an African-American man and a woman,
yes.
Still 2 other white men. Is this at least a vague step in the right direction?
It's a really important step in the right direction. So the earlier Apollo missions from the early 70s, late 60s, there the astronauts were mostly test pilots, chosen specifically for aeronautics expertise and their experience with flying different vehicles. Right now, the mission has broader goals, some science experiments, some engineering experiments. So this is why the technical skills are diverse, as well as the human beings themselves are diverse.
They also don't all come from the military. I mean, that's where almost all of them came, although I think Neil Armstrong himself was a civilian.
Yes. So you mean in the past or currently?
Well, now I think not everyone comes from the military.
Yes. So 3 of the 4 come from the military, and then the lady doesn't. So that is the big difference in terms of their background.
For so long, the space race didn't really reflect humanity, and it was a function, I suppose, of the United States and Russia and their rivalry. Things have changed a little bit. We've had people from India in space. We've had people from China in space. It may be that we're about to start a new space race or a new space era. Let's hope it's a space era, not a space race. Do you think humanity will be better reflected? Do you think all of us will be a part of it this time?
Yes, there are actually 2 important differences with these particular missions. And already with this crew, one of the astronauts is from Canada, whilst previously it was all Americans. So there's already diversity in nationality. But future missions will also be commercial space missions. So SpaceX is preparing the next launcher and also the lander for the future moon missions. So that's already changing about who can be there. And with some of those commercial enterprises coming on board, some of the seats going on to the moon should actually be available for anybody who can afford it. And so it is really opening it up, indeed.
So, I mean, it used to be really the only way to get to the moon was to fly for an American military. Now, things are going to be open to people who can pay. They'll be open to people of other skills. That should lead to a lot more diversity, and people who also, in the future at least, won't just be American or Russian.
Yes, yes. And that also means the people to appreciate this, when we point to the moon and talk about humans there, it should be a broader, a spectrum of us really being excited and inspired by this. And I think that's one of the things I'm really, that excite me about this.
I mean, in the past, the contribution of black women who were called computers, in other words, people who did the maths,
yes.
There's a great movie about it. They basically had to stay on the ground, often in a back room.
Yes, yes, yes. So these role models are now coming to the fore, and that's really, really important. We'll hear from them, after they come from these experiences. And I actually had the great privilege of working at NASA in a room particularly called the Moon Room, where some of these missions were designed, and also the privilege of meeting some of the astronauts who'd come back. And some of the family members were talking about, their dads being on the moon. And so now it's not just these astronauts we are seeing on the TV cameras, is the families who will be telling those stories, and it will be a broad spectrum of people telling these stories. And I think we really have to be excited about that.
American families themselves, within themselves, have become more diverse over time too, I suspect.
Yes, yes.
It's the first trip to carry humans to the moon in a long time, 50 years. Has rocket technology changed, or is it still as difficult and as dangerous now as it was in the 1970s?
So it has changed a lot. It has become cheaper. So the rockets that are launched are now reused, and SpaceX actually just published some of the cost estimates, and right now they're about 10 times cheaper than they were back then. So that means the technology needed to reuse would be to get this navigation going up and then back down, really precise. Some of that has changed. Some of the fueling has changed. So indeed, and one of the other big things about this particular mission is that it's a much bigger rocket, because much bigger cargo will be taken up to do more things. So to develop those bigger rockets has meant a new technology just in itself.
There's a famous moment when the Americans were about to land on the moon for the first time in 1969. I'm sure you'll know this better than I do. There was an error overflow in the computer because the computer couldn't manage all of the information. Yes. Computing is vital to all of this, isn't it?
Yes, yes. And the computers that were used back then were smaller than the computers in our own phones here. And now that has changed completely. It's both computing power and the software that you use. There will be some artificial intelligence in some of those computing, particularly with aspects to do with navigation once on the moon, things like self-navigation coming into play. So yes, we are talking a completely different ball game. The amount of data that will be, captured once there is completely, on a different scale at the moment, indeed.
So after this trip, the plan is to land people on the moon.
Yes.
And in the past, the trips to the moon were very short.
Okay.
Do you think that it's possible to stay on the moon for some time, to almost have a permanent settlement there? And you would obviously have to take your own oxygen. Yes.
So the plan is that some of those resources that will be needed by human beings, on the moon, and then resources also to do things like fuel your vehicles, fuel missions going to next stages such as Mars. The plan is to try and source them from the moon. So one of the things, for example, with this particular landing, it will be to the poles of the moon where water is expected. So some of that will be mined, and oxygen with, drawn from that wherever possible, and other materials that might help with the fueling. So things have changed in the sense that, yes, some resources will be, such as oxygen you mentioned, we would normally take for granted here, will need to be produced there, but it doesn't mean it will all be brought from Earth. Some will be, as much as possible will be mined from whatever is on the moon.
Professor, I've read too much science fiction in my life, and half of these books are set on Mars. Do you think human beings will ever actually get there? Is Elon Musk going to be the one who does it?
So he'll certainly contribute to some of the vehicles that will get us there, and so yeah, that South African will play a big role. I think we will get there. It's just about when, and yeah, so I think we will get there.
Professor Lerothodi, Leeuw, thank you very much indeed. I think, as you can see, I could talk to you for hours about this. Professor of Astrophysics at the University of the Western Cape.